Hello, Namaskar. Welcome to NatStrat Conversations. My name is Pankaj Saran, and I welcome all of you to yet another episode of NatStrat Conversations, in which we talk about major geopolitical, security, and technology issues. Today, I have with me a very distinguished guest, someone who has been with us in the past before, Zorawar Daulet Singh, someone who is well known in strategic circles, who is a writer, a commentator, an author of 4 books. In fact, two of his books have been on China. And today, we are picking up the topic of the US China relationship in the post San Francisco era, if I can call it that. The San Francisco spirit or the San Francisco vision is something which has been an important milestone in this relationship. And we will discuss various aspects of this, including what it means for the US China relationship, what it means for global stability, and of course, most importantly, what it means for India. So, welcome, Zorawar, to this show. Thank you for coming again, and a pleasure to have you with us. I want to ask you your first impressions of what happened in San Francisco, what it means both in terms of optics and in terms of substance.
Sure. Thank you again, Ambassador Saran. Great to be back at NatStrat. So I think this is, of course, a very, very significant meeting between these two major powers. As we know, for the last several years, there has been a process of acrimony, a public acrimony. There's been an information war from both sides. There has been a suggestion that they are on the verge of, if not a Cold War, an intense strategic competition. So I think this particular summit has come as some of a surprise to the Indian establishment, I think to Asians at large, that how is this suddenly sort of flipped? We can get into some of the themes and the reasons why that has happened, and I can share with that. But I think from the last several months, it was quite clear that the US Biden administration wanted to stabilize ties with China. In June, they sent literally the entire cabinet of the Biden administration to Beijing. That was followed up by the Chinese foreign minister meeting Biden and the White House in October, which led to this meeting. So I think it's significant. It's calmed things down. It's stabilized Sino-American ties.
Yeah. I want to actually take this a little forward. If you look at the history of the engagement in the last 3 years, since the start of the Biden administration, what strikes you actually is most interesting that they started from a rough patch. You know, the first meeting between the national security advisors and the foreign ministers took place in Anchorage in Alaska in March 2021. Then that was a rough meeting. But then you had the first virtual summit on the 15th of November between the two leaders, 2021. Interestingly, the next summit was also 15 November 2022 in Bali. And lo and behold, this year also the summit has been on the 15th of November in San Francisco. So it seems 15th November has been the date chosen for these summit meetings, number one. Number two, you know, these are practically annual summits, the kind of summits you would expect to have between friends and strategic partners like maybe India, Russia, India, Japan. So this scale and the regularity, and as you said, the interregnum has seen a lot of high-level cabinet meetings, high-level access given to high officials by both leaders, and meetings of congressional delegations with President Xi Jinping, etc., etc. But this has also been accompanied by various legislations and executive orders in the United States, basically targeted at China or Chinese companies in terms of technology and in terms of also increasing US competitiveness, as part of its strategic competition with the United States. So, are we seeing in the last 3 years the steady kind of stabilization of this engagement at the very highest level between the two most influential and consequential nations in the world? Where is this leading to? And we can discuss the specifics of San Francisco in a bit. But it also comes to my mind that next year we will have elections in the United States, and it would be pretty reasonable to assume that President Xi Jinping is going to outlast President Biden. It's a, probably a slightly reckless comment to make, but it would assume it is plausible that this might happen. So I want you to first talk to us about what the San Francisco, the kind of outcomes that we saw. And I would also actually like to also tell our viewers about some of the phrases that struck me that were used by both sides in their briefings. But first, on the specific outcomes, if you can talk a little bit on what it
Right.
actually means.
So I think just before we come to that, I just wanted to share that since the Trump years, when a particular type of an economic war or a reset of the Sino-American economic relationship was sort of launched by the US, since the Biden administration, there's been an attempt to make a far more sophisticated China policy. So I think when the Biden team comes in, they are clear that they don't want to break off ties with China. They want this competition to be channeled in a direction where the United States reserves the right to compete where it wants and cooperate where it wants. So that was their preference. Now, when the Chinese looked at this, part of them said, okay, we've got an opportunity to reopen economic ties, uh, damp down some of the hard uh, export controls and technology controls, or what Sullivan calls it, like a small yard and a high fence, which was very restricted and leaving the rest of this economic interdependence to grow. But I think what the Chinese also were concerned about is because Trump, after all, was not really concerned with a Cold War with China. He was looking out for national interests of the United States. Mm-hmm. What the neocons and who are very much part of this administration, let's face it, wanted a very sophisticated grand strategy around Eurasia. Russia was, of course, their primary target. We've seen the Ukraine crisis. And I think China was always a part of putting pressure on Russia to get the Chinese to submit to their terms. So I'm just trying to give you the geopolitical. So what happens is when Ukraine war unfolds, you see the Biden team reaching out to China to, in a sense, make it non-aligned on that conflict. This was in 2022 spring. That doesn't really work. The Chinese, of course, and we know from their own internal analysis and publications that they feared they'd be next if Russia loses.
Absolutely.
So, ironically, the Chinese, the Indians, and the global South, nobody wanted Russia to fail because that would be a return to the old unipolar, West-dominated hegemonic system. So, in a strange quirk, you see a multitude of actors which might not normally agree coming to say that this Ukraine conflict is not something that we buy into. Mm-hmm. The NATO. So fast forward to the summer of 2023, you have this Ukrainian counteroffensive, it's called. It leads to a complete debacle for NATO. You see Ukrainian forces completely smashed, stuck literally in their forward positions. They've not broken through anything. That change, culminating in also a change in the way the global South was looking at this, I believe is what prompted the United States to quickly accelerate what you have laid out, was a series of meetings. And it's not surprising that it's in June that US policymakers start rushing to China. And you see the Chinese also now reciprocating and saying that now we've got a United States that is somewhat more chastened, is going to have some kind of a temporary pause, so to speak. So now coming to the specifics of this particular meeting, I think when you look at the statements from both sides and approaches, there was a lot of confidence by the Chinese side. You've seen it, the speech that Xi Jinping makes to American businesses, the way he's engaging the Americans. From the American side, it's again the old policy being recrafted in a way that allows a normalization or a détente with China, but still reserving the right to compete.
Sure.
So you see a contradiction of what both sides are wanting. I think the Chinese side was saying, let's arrive at the grand overarching principles of what should be the Sino-American relationship, for a modus vivendi. The Americans are not interested in that. And the reason for that is because both sides ultimately can't agree on what should be the nature of world order. The
But I
the
want to stop you there and ask you, what are the triggers for this readiness to get into this dialogue from the Chinese side? I mean,
Sure.
there is a reality out there, which is the problems that China is having internally. So it is not exactly that China is in a very strong position either.
So I would say there are three reasons where the Chinese felt it's seems to be a ripe moment. Firstly, I think they fear some kind of escalation, accidental conflicts around Taiwan. I think that question is something that worries them as well. Of course, it worries. We know it worries the United States and its allies. They wanted to calm things down there. Economic engagement is something which they feel the United States, even though it was articulating it doesn't want to decouple, they were not able to make that next step after Trump. So in a sense, they needed to make this move to allow the Biden administration to have the domestic sort of capital to engage with China on the other parts. The small yard, high fence still stays, advanced microchips, AI, all the dual use stuff, or what Sullivan has called the NSA, that technologies that can change the military balance, those they will safeguard with all their might. But there's $750 billion of trade, and there's
Yeah.
dozens of areas where that possibility of cooperation can occur.
Yeah, but
So I think that's what. Thirdly, I think what the Chinese are also trying to do is they feel that there is an opportunity here to, after Ukraine, with the global power balance shifting, Xi Jinping likes to use this term unprecedented changes in the last 100 years.
correct.
He's What is he talking of? It's a veiled attempt to say that, guys, the old West dominated order is now kind of on its last legs. And they are now wanting to also come into the forefront. They use the term look America in the eyes, look the world in the eyes, which is very different from the Deng
Yeah.
Xiaoping
Yeah.
of keep your head down. So
But
they've already
yeah,
adjusted to that.
yeah.
So this is partly they are stepping up and wanting to play a bigger role, and they see the United States bogged down domestically as well. And of course, as you mentioned, the Chinese economic system is going through its own changes.
Well, I think,
East Asia as well is slowing
yeah,
down.
yeah,
So they would want that growth momentum to also stabilize.
yeah.
So it's a combination of domestic, economic, geopolitical that have given them the confidence to also meet them halfway.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's just confidence or also the need to engage the
Perhaps.
United States and to
Right.
reduce tension because China assesses and is going through internal difficulties, which it was not a few years ago. So there is that impulse coming from within China itself, which says that look, we should go that a little extra mile to establish some kind of a peace and relief as far as the United States is concerned. So
Right.
there is that impulse
Right.
also, and we
Right.
should not overlook that also, because when you look at some of the comments that came out from China on the summit, he said, for example, he's talked about the fact that the San Francisco summit should be the new starting point for stabilizing China-US relations. He also says that there is no zero-sum mentality that should guide us. And then they also, by the way, quote Biden's statement about the fact that the United States does not seek to contain or suppress China's development or to decouple from China. So there is a lot being said by both sides. And the question, of course, is, and then I also noticed the use of the word planet Earth by China, which means that on climate, in fact, the two areas that they identified for focused cooperation were climate and artificial intelligence. And and in San Francisco also they agreed to a large number of mechanisms to be revived, including, of course, on the military side and non-proliferation, policy planning, export controls, and so on. So this is all happening. Uh, the question is, do you think personalities are important? Because there will be elections in the US next year. Xi Jinping is going to be there for many, many years. We know the history of world affairs. Nations are important, national interests are important, but so are personalities.
Right. No, absolutely. And there's that interesting anecdote, right, that occurs, somewhat embarrassing for the Americans, where that journalist asked Biden the question, is Xi Jinping a dictator? So I think we know the Chinese system has been highly centralized. We know power has been consolidated in the party and in this particular leadership. So I think from the Chinese point of view, they are well positioned from a political stability point of view to pursue a policy once they have taken a call on it. I think the wild card really is what's happening in the United States.
No, but
You've
China
got
will not go into all this with a 6 month horizon.
no, of
They are
course not.
putting in place.
Exactly. So which is why I think the debate out here or elsewhere is: did this summit achieve a modus vivendi, a détente, or a tactical pause? And I can go over all three kind of
But
arrangements.
while you're going through that, also tell me about how we in India
Right.
or other strategic analysts overseas are assessing what happened in San Francisco. Are we in denial? Are we underplaying its significance? Are we overreacting? This is all part of the same
Right,
answer.
right, right. So I think maybe jumping straight first to from an Indian point of view, and generally, I think there's been radio silence, frankly, and a bit of denial in India. Uh, I think for the last several years, particularly in the last few years, after the Trump shift, and you saw a re-engagement with from the Biden team with India. Uh, a major portion of that was, of course, aimed at this new Indo-Pacific strategy, finding a new kind of arrangement. India is a very critical non-ally, but a major strategic partner. Now, when you jump straight to the joint statement, not the joint statement, the communique that the White House puts out, they're focusing on ironclad commitments to their allies in Asia. They speak of partners as being important. So, I mean, if I'm an Indian, my first worry would be, are you a bargaining chip when the Sino-American coordination begins to take on? But let's say we're jumping steps ahead. I
Yeah,
think first
yeah.
is, what does this summit really achieve? I don't believe it achieved a modus vivendi because, as I just alluded to, a modus vivendi presumes a congruent vision of world order and each side's place in it. So, in the early 70s, when the United States and China crafted that major breakthrough, it was done because both sides had a common threat. Both sides recognized that they do not, at least the Chinese did not accept this bipolar superpower world where they would be kind of on the sidelines. And the United States accepted China as this rising power in Asia, which deserves to have a role in economic, political, mainstream affairs. Today, uh, the Chinese don't accept a unipolar world, don't accept the old ways of being, while the Americans don't have not accepted China as an equal great power. So I think a modus vivendi is simply not on the cards right now. What we can plausibly suggest has been achieved is you have a détente in place. A détente means when two great powers recognize the costs of competition, which becomes uncontrolled, and a rivalry that can lead to situations that are dangerous not only militarily but even economically. We know that, as you've alluded to, you have a massive economic interaction not just between United States and China, but between the entire collective West, the East Asian alliance system, and China. So you were
But do you
talking of
think
yeah. So to unravel that and fragment that, neither the West nor China want that to happen. So I think when you combine that part with wanting to have some stability in the Eastern Chinese seaboard, nobody wants a major conflict there.
Yeah, of
I think
course.
both sides came to an understanding that military communications, confidence building measures, stabilizing that front suits both sides.
So let us
But yeah,
let us then to kind of reduce it to a kind of a digestible form. Basically, what you are saying is that San Francisco is part of a process which is accelerating in the last 3 years. It is by far the most substantive summit since 2021. It has had solid outcomes, and it will not resolve the fundamental contradictions of the global architecture, but it has gone a long way in contributing to stability and predictability and management of the relationship.
absolutely.
And here The Chinese Foreign Ministry has quoted President Xi Jinping as saying that China has no plans to surpass or unseat the United States. So, statements coming from both sides are very clear cut, very powerful. The question is, do we believe them and take them at face value, or do we recognize that there are far deeper fissures and irreconcilable aspects of the relationship? So, I just want to now move forward by asking you that against this backdrop, how do you see the rest of the world responding to what has happened in San Francisco? Um, Particularly, when you are sitting in Europe and in Russia, how do you think those governments and those strategic communities are going to assess this particular process, and also the event itself, San Francisco, because both for its optics and substance.
Right. So maybe we can go literally move from US allies to Russia in India, and then maybe the global south. So US allies, I think on the whole, this was of course coordinated, as in they are going to be brought on board. We've seen the UK itself making some noise about stabilizing ties with China. Europeans, of course, did not want any breakdown, especially with their economies in shambles after the severing of a very lucrative energy supply chain that they had with the Russians. So just the other day, I think you had the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Chinese foreign ministers kind of in a what was optically seen as a fairly a profound image of stability and cooperation
Absolutely.
in East Asia.
No doubt about that.
There's no
Yeah.
doubt about it. So I
Yeah.
think as far as US allies are concerned, they are going to have a sigh of relief. Their economies are in bad shape. They need the Chinese market. They need stability with China. And of course, they have the security relationship with the United States. So they've always wanted to choose both aspects, right? You have the ties with Washington, but you want economic engagement with China. And they are quite happy with that. I think as far as the global south is concerned, even they are, in a sense, have never wanted to make that choice between the West and the East, right? Mm-hmm. They like this positive non-alignment, you could say multi-vector foreign policies, a globalization that is not dominated by the decisions of a single power center. We know that globalization, as it unfolds now in the coming years, is likely to be a more multilateral affair, sure, a more diversified affair, a multipolar affair. So as far as they see it, they see a trend that is not leading to another Cold War, right? So that's a good thing. The Russians, of course, had presumed, even though I don't think they were particularly relishing the prospect of being dependent on the Chinese economy. As we know, they want to diversify ties, and they very much were very keen to even deepen ties with India, as we saw after Ukraine. So I think they are, for them, their core priority vis-a-vis the US-China is a China that doesn't turn its back on Russia and becomes doing things which could hurt Russian core interests. So I don't think we are that far yet. I think that's something which they will have to work out.
But I'm sure people in Moscow, when you see your closest strategic partner going further and further deeper into this relationship and the management of it with the United States, which is your number one principal adversary, regardless of what the Russians may say in public to us or otherwise, certainly it does not augur well, or it does not speak well of the Russia-China relationship. So it opens this prospect of suspicion and hedging. So Russia hedging against a US-China, let us use the word détente, or kind of a more sustainable relationship, is a new factor.
Absolutely. I mean, they've got to, like India and the rest of the non-allied states, because the US allies, frankly, are already in a system, in a collective security system. But those that are developing security objectives on their own strength have to, of course, account for the possibility that the US-China stability might have repercussions for their regions, right? I mean, South Asia, for example, as we know, you have Pakistan, which now has two allies, right? You have a classic non-NATO status that they got from Washington, but they also have fairly deep ties with the Chinese. So the Russians are going to, of course, look at this, and I think they recognize as the rest of the world, that the massive economic linkages that have been developed are simply too profound to have any other alternative for the Chinese but to seek stability with the West and their allies. There is no other alternative in the medium term of the next
But the
decade.
timing is of essence, that at exactly the time
Yeah,
when the US Russia relationship is at its historical worst since
right,
1990,
right.
since the end of the Cold War. What you are witnessing from Moscow is that your closest strategic partner is being wined and dined by your primary adversary, which is your
Absolutely.
existential threat.
Right.
Clearly, the scenes are not good. I mean, the images are not good.
In some ways, not just in Moscow, but even in Delhi, I think the idea that we have been told that the biggest strategic challenge for the United States is China, while at the same time you have a irrational state of confrontation that the West has continued to perpetuate with Russia, and is now opening up with China, is of course sending a mixed message to even the
Yeah.
Indian
So we'll
establishment.
come to the India.
Yeah,
I thought I'll keep that
yeah,
for the latter part of
sure,
the
sure.
conversation. But just again, veering back.
Hmm.
So when you look at the US-China, it's a multi-domain, multi-pillar relationship. What are the, in terms of functional aspects, which are the tracks which might proceed or which might accelerate? I see people to people exchanges going faster. You know, they've talked about passenger flights, etc. You know, the number of Chinese, reaching the United States, studying there, etc. So that's one track. But then you also have the more difficult tracks, and the most difficult is technology, and technology that has military applications. But then you also have investments and securitization. So on these multiple tracks, I presume you would be of the opinion that the technology and military applications technology part of the relationship and the attempt to increase US competitiveness vis-a-vis China would remain unchanged despite San Francisco and, let's say, the spirit of San
Right,
Francisco.
right. I mean, that's the big debate, right, in the
Yeah.
United States, that what is the size of this small yard in high fence? I mean, and it's not clear cut on where they will eventually settle the United States. Is it going to be just advanced microchips? Because after all, this summit spoke about AI
It
as a
spoke, yes,
possibility
exactly.
of so the United States, I mean, when we talk of United States, means we're talking of the globalist elite, Main Street America. I think they are so entangled with planetary affairs in the sense that they are linked with all the major economies, and they can't fathom the idea that it's all going to be done at home. So they are going to have
Yeah.
these supply chains. Now, of course, they want to de-risk and diversify away from China, but ultimately it comes down to economics and profits as well for them. So, I mean, we're talking of simple things like supply of advanced microchips. You simply cannot, in a period of 5 years, produce the volume that you need in the United States to sustain the industrial system
Yeah.
as it exists today.
Sure.
So there is a necessity for
So
this to be
then,
staggered over a period of years. But
yeah.
let's move to even some of the other areas of what you said, possibly.
And no, but
Yeah.
while you're doing that, so from here, do you escalate to this whole concept of G2, or that we are far away from that? So just in the
Sure,
part of
sure.
that, yeah.
So, what is a G2? So, I would say, let's look at a G2 of the past. The US Soviets, there was a period of time where the Chinese felt, when they were on the sidelines in the late 50s, early 60s, that the Moscow and Washington are going to craft an order where all the rest are kind of going to be on the sidelines, right? Because the superpowers had such enormous security dominance over the system that it was a G2,
Sure,
but they
sure,
had no
sure.
economic interdependence. So I'm saying, maybe to build on what you were suggesting, is that now you don't have the security interdependence today. The Chinese military power is nowhere close to what Soviet power was then, and even what perhaps Russian global military power is today. It's very regional, right? It's regional, focused on the Taiwan sector and perhaps the first island chain, maybe crossing over that. So it's very, very regional, which is why the idea of a G2 comes to conceptions of global economy. G2 in who will regulate economic affairs, who will regulate the future direction of the technologies and the energy supply chains and the
Yeah.
industrial supply chains that we all need as major economies. But that makes G2 a very different affair, because if you do not have the military parity with the United States, which the Chinese can never
So you may
attain,
not have a G2
you will
world
have,
order.
yeah,
You may have a G2
you may
economic
have,
order.
you certainly are going to see a G2 economic system in some form or the other already in place, but it doesn't have the ingredients of institutions to support it, of actual coordination happening. And when that happens, I think the debates will have to start in India and elsewhere
Yeah.
on, because you certainly, when you have a G2 economic system which is interlinked, it's not the Warsaw Pact and
The question is whether you'll have a G2 technological system, because
yeah,
then here
yeah,
you're already moving down different technology paths.
right.
So
But they don't necessarily need to be completely mutually exclusive. You can still have two systems that are still very, very closely engaging on certain fundamental norms that you need for, because after all, they're all going to be, they need scale. They need the global side to be a
I
part
think
of
in
it.
that case, what we have to do is to go further granular,
Yeah.
and within the technology
Yes.
box, talk about individual
Individual
technologies.
technologies, perhaps.
And that
Yeah.
would lead to a very,
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
detailed and a
Yeah.
different conversation.
But all this suggests that the US China relationship is so entangled that the idea of how we used to use terms like competition, Cold War, I think we need a different framework to it. And I think for the
Sure.
last 10 years, 20 years, you've had many kinds of nomenclature that's been suggested. But I think now we are beginning to see that this is going to be a reality. Security competition and economic interdependence can coexist.
I think the words they're using are having a stable relationship,
Yeah.
having a more resilient relationship, and having greater certainty and a new momentum in uncertain times. So I think each of these words carries a lot of weight. But now let's come back and
Sure.
finally focus on what this all means for India as such, per se, and for how China will view India and for the shape of India China relations. Your thoughts?
So, so these are of course big themes, and but I would say our, that is India's foreign policy, very very clearly and palpably over the last decade, half decade, certainly in the last 3 4 years, has very openly sought a balance of power strategy. What I mean by that is engagement, intensive security engagement, political engagement, economic engagement with the United States was aimed not just as a good in itself, but also to gain bargaining advantage or leverage with China. Now, that's where, if that indeed is what the Indian strategic approach was, I think we're going to have to maybe adapt towards something a bit more sophisticated. Because if our premise
Mhm.
was that the United States is going to engage in a competition with China at a scale which was not envisioned, what we are now beginning to see, which is far more sophisticated and far more fluid and has many areas of cooperation, areas that are going to be left on the side. Because I think what we've seen in the summit is that they are not letting red lines or core interests obstruct movement.
Yeah, true,
And that's stopping India and China, right?
true.
You have core interests on both sides that have kind of frozen this relationship. Now, we recognize there is a problem on the frontiers. There's a disputed border. Been a major crisis in Ladakh from 2020. Things have, of course, calmed down. They are very stable now from what they were. The prospects of a major escalation have receded. But we have not reached that stage of a similar détente with the Chinese.
Yeah, exactly. So
I think that's something, of course, for the policymakers to reckon with, that what is that timing and when it suits you. But certainly, if the belief in the Indian establishment is that the relationship with the United States will bring China to the bargaining table, I don't think we're going to see that. I think the Chinese have seen success from the summit. They feel that they have neutralized the hardliners in Washington. They have preempted the possibility of a second front. I'm talking of a second NATO front in the Pacific. So we are seeing
so
success on that
exactly.
front.
Yeah. So
And let's not underestimate that, and let's not be in denial about
no,
that.
no, exactly.
Yeah.
So the question is, this movement, let's say San Francisco as a short turn
Yeah.
of phrase, is it going to make the Chinese more or less receptive and enthusiastic about making overtures to restore the status quo with India and to take the India relationship forward? Or Will they see this as a strategic benefit, and that they see that they're coming to India with a much stronger hand, and therefore their bargaining positions will be that much tougher?
I would tend to agree closer with the latter. I don't see them in any way feeling that they have to make concessions or overtures to India. I think what the Chinese have been suggesting and is that we are going to meet the Indian side halfway. Now, but that conversation can only begin if you come to a larger overarching principle of what you would like a relationship with the Chinese to look like. We obviously know. I think it's important to now spell this out. We can't have a cold war with the Chinese. We are not in a state of existential conflict or competition with China. This is
Some people think we are.
I don't believe that's the case as far as India is concerned. It's not an identity conflict. It's not a cultural conflict. It's not a civilizational conflict. It is not even a conflict over beyond the frontiers on the nature of world order in, let's say, this region or even elsewhere. There is a common belief that multipolarity is a good thing. Yes, there are some who argue that Chinese want multipolarity, but in Asia they
With
want to
Chinese
dominate
characteristics.
with or they want to be the hegemon in Asia. But I think that they may want anything, but that's not a reality, right? It can't happen because you have the Russians, you have the Americans, and you have the Indians and many others who, by their sheer existence, create a balance of power.
Right.
So, if you are dealing with a plural, diversified, multipolar world, there is no option but to have some kind of a relationship with the Chinese. Now we have to, in our own minds, first arrive at what is the nature of this relationship and what is the degree of competition. Because the Americans have very clearly, they have not settled on an equilibrium yet. They are still saying strategic competition exists, but the sectors and domains and the regions where it will exist are still very much up for negotiation. Like, for example, they are not saying the competition is going to extend to the Indian Ocean or to South Asia or to West Asia. It's focused on East Asia at the moment. The military security part of it,
But
dynamics.
more than geographical, I think it's also domain based.
Domain based, absolutely.
as we
So
said,
high
technology,
technology and all those
yeah.
things, absolutely. But
Right.
it is not a planetary wide superpower contest for ultimate existential dominance. I don't think that has been kind of set aside, not because the Americans were not like that, but I think the power advantage that they possessed 25 years ago has completely vanished from the scene. And you're dealing with a West that is much weaker and more pragmatic and more prone to making adjustments, even if they're tactical, with its rivals.
Yeah, but I think, I mean, my opinion, I think the jury is still out on the whole issue of, the West is dead kind of argument.
Agreed.
That
We're
I
talking
think
in a
maybe
relative sense.
in a
Yeah,
relative sense,
yeah.
because that I think could be a rather extremist view to take. But just to wind up, because I think we're running out of time, I think 2024 is going to be interesting. Elections in the United States, elections in India. There will be opportunities for resetting relationships, for reviewing entrenched positions, for seeing both greater fluidity at one level, but also greater certainty, especially maybe perhaps on the Ukraine front, where we're looking increasingly at a stalemate, which was not the case in 2022. So I think as we approach the new year, there will be these different impulses playing out. And I think San Francisco seems to have set a certain template which needs close examination and analysis by India, for the simple reason that we share this huge boundary and border with China. So what happens in China clearly does not stay in China, and it impacts us. So, but thank you very much, Zorawar,
Thank you, Basil.
for joining us and for giving us the benefit of your insights and comments. Thank you so much. Dear listeners, viewers, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you have enjoyed the conversation and that you will continue to follow us in the future. Goodbye, and till our next episode, thank you so much.